She was the new black girl in class. Quiet, unnoticed, invisible. But when the school's golden boy mocked her for being from the hood, the laughter echoed louder than the lesson. Then came the math challenge. One that had stumped every student. Jalaiah didn't flinch. She just looked up, smiled once, and wrote the answer in 5 seconds flat. The room froze. The teacher stared. And Trevor, he never saw what hit him. Because brilliance speaks loudest when you never expect it to. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The first bell of the year echoed through the grand hallways of Lakeshore Academy, a school built more like a monument than an institution. Located in an upscale suburban town where luxury SUVs lined the streets and housekeepers dropped off students. Lakeshore stood as a fortress of generational privilege. Its floors gleamed, the lockers were spotless, and even the vending machines were newer than the textbooks in most inner-city schools. Trevor Maddox strutted into the school's main building, like it was his second home. His expensive cologne trailed behind him, his AirPods in, and his varsity jacket slung over one shoulder. Not for warmth, but as a statement. Trevor was a walking brand. Everything about him, from the curated Instagram posts to his place at the center lunch table, screamed power. His father, Charles Maddox, had donated $3 million to the school's athletic complex. Trevor didn't just attend Lakeshore, he helped own it. Students laughed louder when he laughed. Teachers bent rules when he asked. He wasn't brilliant. His GPA hovered just above eligibility. But he had what mattered in this world. Confidence, whiteness, and money. And when you had all three, no one asked questions. But today, Trevor noticed something unfamiliar. A girl entered the classroom. Not late, not early. She moved like a shadow, deliberate, quiet, unreadable. Her name was Jalaiah Brooks, and this was her first day at Lakeshore. Her transfer had barely made a ripple through the student body. Inner-city kid on a scholarship. Must be a diversity quota. That's what most assumed. Trevor noticed immediately. Not because she was walled. She wasn't. Not because she made a scene. She didn't. But because she refused to look at anyone. Refused to perform. Refused to smile. That, to Trevor, was a threat. Jalaiah found an empty seat in the back of the room and pulled out a thin, battered notebook. She clicked her pen 3 times, opened the front cover, and began writing. The class hadn't even started yet. Trevor raised an eyebrow and nudged Peyton, his right-hand lackey. "What's she doing, solving world peace already?" Peyton snorted. "Probably trying to impress Ms. Aldridge." Laughter bubbled in small circles around them. The mocking wasn't loud, but it was sharp, surgical. Jalaiah didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge it at all. Ms. Aldridge walked in moments later, setting down her coffee and laptop with practiced ease. A tall woman in her early 40s with salt-streaked hair and sensible heels. She didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Years of teaching at Lakeshore had trained her to read a room instantly, and her eyes briefly landed on Jalaiah with a flicker of curiosity. Then she began the first lesson of the semester. The topic was mathematics, not basic algebra. Lakeshore jumped straight into higher-order problem-solving. On the board appeared a complex logic equation, one designed not just to teach, but to humble. Ms. Aldridge turned toward the class. "This equation stumped half of last year's senior class," she said calmly. "But let's see how our new juniors do. Anyone want to take a stab?" Silent. Trevor leaned back, grinning. "I got it," he said loudly. He strutted to the board, scribbled for 30 seconds, then underlined his answer with a flourish. He stepped back, arms folded, soaking in the minor applause from his circle. Miss Aldridge glanced at the board, then tilted her head. "Incorrect. Try again." "Oof," Peyton whispered, laughing. Trevor scratched his head. "Seriously?" The teacher didn't reply. Another student tried. Wrong. Another. Still wrong. That's when Trevor turned, eyes locking onto Jalaiah, who hadn't looked up once. He grinned. "Hey, new girl," he called out. "You writing poetry or solving the equation back there?" The room chuckled. Jalaiah didn't move. Trevor kept going, louder this time. "Scon scholarship girl. Let's see what kind of magic they teach in the hood." The class froze. Some students laughed awkwardly, unsure whether to lean in or pull away. Others glanced at Ms. Aldridge, who stared hard at Trevor but said nothing. Jalaiah finally looked up. Her eyes met Trevor's. There was no anger, no embarrassment, just calculation. She slowly closed her notebook and stared at the board, Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Trevor chuckled. Didn't think so. He turned back toward his seat. As he sat down, Miss Aldridge quietly walked to the back and placed a folded worksheet on Jelia's desk. Optional, she said gently. For those who like challenges. Jelia looked down at the paper. It was a multi-page logic exam. Graduate-level work, far beyond what Lakeshore required. She glanced once at the first question, then slowly smiled. Not the kind of smile you give when someone's kind. The kind you give when someone just made their first mistake. Trevor publicly challenges Jelia to answer a problem no one in class could solve. She doesn't say a word yet. The laughter began as a ripple. Small, unsure, the kind of sound that tests boundaries. But as Trevor's voice grew louder, more confident, the ripple turned into a wave. The other students, wrapped in the safety of their privilege and groupthink, leaned into it. They weren't laughing at a joke. They were participating in a public performance of ridicule, one that required only silence to endorse, and they offered it freely. Jelia sat still. Her fingers remained resting on the edge of her notebook, her gaze locked not on the equation Trevor failed to solve, but on something beyond the classroom walls. It wasn't detachment, it was strategy. She had learned long ago that responding to ridicule only sharpened its blade. What these students didn't realize was that her silence wasn't fear, it was restraint. Trevor had no such restraint. The more the class responded, the more he pressed forward. He mocked the way she hadn't spoken a single word since entering. He imitated the way she walked head down, avoiding eye contact. Then, with a smug grin, he began to suggest she probably didn't even understand English fluently. That she must have come from one of those schools. He didn't say the word ghetto yet, but it danced on the edge of every sentence. Peyton laughed the loudest. Ms. Aldridge remained at her desk, her hands clasped lightly in front of her, her face unreadable. She had seen this before. Every year there was one student who didn't fit. Not because they couldn't keep up, but because they didn't play the social game. And every year someone like Trevor made it their personal mission to crush them. Sometimes with open insults, but more often with veiled ones, delivered with a smile that teachers had been trained to ignore. But something about this was different. The quiet. The way Jelia didn't blink, didn't fold. The way she absorbed cruelty like it was nothing more than wind brushing past her. That kind of silence, it wasn't surrender, it was endurance. Then it happened. Trevor turned toward the class, now energized by attention, and finally said what he'd been hinting at all along. He made a crude imitation of Jelia's supposed home life, using a fake accent, mimicking food stamps, describing a cracked sidewalk and a broken home. The word ghetto finally left his mouth, hung in the air like a thick fog, and silenced even the giggles that had been riding on his coattails. Ms. Aldridge's fingers twitched. Her gaze shifted, not to Trevor, but to Jelia. She watched for a flinch, a blink, a wince. Nothing. Only the slow, deliberate motion of a pen dragging across paper, continuing its silent mission. But beneath the calm surface, Ms. Aldridge sensed something powerful building. Not rage, something colder, sharper. The teacher stood abruptly, the screech of her chair drawing every student's attention. For a moment it felt like she might intervene, but instead she simply walked to the board, erased the problem, and said they would revisit it next week. Her voice remained steady, as if acknowledging the insult would give it more power than it deserved. But that didn't mean she hadn't heard it. The rest of the class unfolded like a funeral march. Gone were the chuckles, the side comments. A silence settled over the room, not the respectful kind, but the kind born of discomfort. No one wanted to look at Jelia now, not because they pitied her, but because they were afraid they'd see themselves reflected in her eyes. Whispers began circulating quietly. As the class transitioned into independent work, whispers about who Jelia really was, what kind of school she'd come from, why she hadn't reacted. Some speculated she didn't understand what Trevor had said. Others, more observant, noted the faint twitch of her eyebrow when he crossed the line. She understood perfectly. As Trevor sank back into his seat, he felt the high of attention start to fade. He scanned the room, expecting approving nods, but something had shifted. The atmosphere was no longer playful. It had turned dense, heavy, and Jelia had still not said a single word. She simply continued writing, page after page, never once looking up again. What she was writing, no one knew. Equations? Observations? Plans? But there was an intensity to her that made the space around her feel less like a desk, and more like a storm gathering at its center. As the bell neared, Ms. Aldridge moved quietly between desks, handing out the next day's assignments. She paused at Julia's desk. There she placed a thick, stapled math packet. Its cover was blank, no school logo, no title, just a single word handwritten in the top corner. Optional. She didn't explain. She didn't lean down. She didn't say it loud enough for anyone else to hear. But her fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary. Julia looked at the packet. Then slowly, she lifted her gaze, not to the teacher but across the room, directly at Trevor. It was the first time their eyes met since the insults began. And in that moment, something passed between them. Not anger, not revenge, something worse. Certainty.
Then she smiled.
Not a wide grin, not one of joy. A quiet, controlled smile. The kind that made Trevor's stomach turn, though he didn't understand why. He looked away first. At the end of class, Ms. Aldridge slips a math packet onto Julia's desk. Optional, she says. Julia looks at it, then up at Trevor, and for the first time she smiles. Trevor Maddox had never heard the word no spoken with weight. Not from teachers, not from coaches, not from the doormen who opened gates when he arrived late to school functions. The world, from the time he was a toddler wearing monogrammed sweaters, had knelt to his existence. Rules were suggestions. Boundaries were made for other people. When Trevor interrupted class, it was excused as personality. When he cheated, it was dismissed as creativity. And when he failed, someone else quietly bore the consequences. At home, the reinforcement was constant. Charles Maddox, his father, was a towering man who talked like a senator and moved like a businessman, who hadn't had to explain himself in 20 years. Over a dinner of medium-rare steaks and imported wine, Charles would remind Trevor of the Maddox legacy, of the way their bloodline had built this town, of the way people like them rose, by never looking down, unless it was to step over someone slower. If someone's quiet, they're beneath you, he'd say between bites. You lead, they follow. That's the order of things. Trevor believed it, not because he understood it, but because it had never been proven wrong. While Trevor returned home to a marble foyer and a housekeeper who laid out his clothes, Julia Brooks walked alone down a cracked sidewalk, her backpack heavy and her shoes biting into the sides of her feet. The neighborhood she passed through wasn't unsafe, but it was unwelcoming. Every manicured lawn seemed to flinch at her presence. Porch lights flicked on unnecessarily, curtains twitched. Gated communities didn't need to speak to send a message. You don't belong here. She kept her head down, walking with purpose, even though her legs ached. Her apartment was 20 blocks from Lakeshore, in the older part of town where sidewalks were uneven and potholes were permanent. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital. The apartment wasn't big, one bedroom, one pull-out couch, but it held quiet, and quiet was sacred. Inside, the walls were thin. She could hear the neighbors arguing about bills, the sirens that never truly faded, the television always on in the unit below. But Julia had learned to shut it out. She created silence, not by force, but by focus. She opened the math packet Ms. Aldridge had slipped onto her desk like a secret challenge. Optional, the cover had said. But nothing was ever optional in Julia's world, not if you wanted to escape. She pulled out a fresh notebook, labeled it with the date, sat at the tiny kitchen table, a dim lamp buzzing overhead, and began. The problems weren't easy. That was the point. They weren't just difficult, they were layered. Some were multi-step logic questions that bent the mind. Others required pattern recognition, deep algebraic synthesis, or abstract reasoning. Julia didn't flinch. She didn't just solve them. She dismantled them, step by step, annotating the margins, noting shortcuts, and alternate solutions. Sometimes she paused, not because she was stuck, but because her thoughts were moving faster than her pen. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. She didn't look up. There was a photo taped to the wall beside her, not framed, just taped. It was her brother Kareem, smiling on a basketball court. Before the arrest, before the system branded him a felon for a robbery he didn't commit. He had been 17. She was 10. He taught her how to break codes and patterns in video games, how to recognize structure. After he was taken, she turned that skill inward. Now she solved structures the world didn't want her to touch. At 2:17 a.m., Julia put her pencil down. The packet was complete. But she wasn't done. She flipped back to the first page and began reworking each problem, looking for cleaner solutions. She wasn't aiming to impress Miss Aldridge. She wasn't trying to prove anything to Trevor. This was for her. This was control in a world that had denied her family justice, safety, and dignity. Meanwhile, in Trevor's world, the lights were off by 11. His mother poured a glass of wine and streamed a crime drama. Trevor lay in bed, scrolling through his socials, chuckling at a meme someone had made of Jalaiah, her face photoshopped onto a chalkboard covered in question marks. It had already gotten 200 likes. He double-tapped it, reposted it with the caption, "She's gonna need this optional packet like she needs a GPS to find Lakeshore." Then he laughed himself to sleep. Morning came like a slap. At Lakeshore, students filtered in with their usual chatter, though some eyes darted toward the back of the room where Jalaiah always sat. There was an air of anticipation, unspoken but heavy. Trevor strolled in late, again tossing his bag on his desk with dramatic flair. He looked over at Jalaiah, expecting the same blank stare. But she was already sitting upright, her packet on the edge of her desk. Trevor's smugness faltered. Just a hair. Miss Aldridge entered right on time. Her eyes scanned the room, resting on Jalaiah for a heartbeat longer than anyone else. She took attendance, then asked the class to begin their reading assignment. As the rustle of pages filled the air, Jalaiah stood up silently and walked to the front of the class. All eyes followed her. Without saying a word, she placed the math packet on Miss Aldridge's desk. Finished. But more than finished. Annotated, corrected, and in some places, extended. She had rewritten one question, offering an improved version with clearer logic. Another she had solved using two distinct methods. One traditional, one creative. Each page bore neat, clean handwriting, and a confidence that didn't ask for approval. She returned to her seat as silently as she had risen. Miss Aldridge stared at the packet. Her fingers traced the edges. She didn't look at Jalaiah. Not yet. She opened to the first page. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. She turned to the second, then the third. By the fourth, she stopped reading. The classroom noise melted into background static. Miss Aldridge's eyes lingered on a note Jalaiah had written in the margin. This solution assumes a fixed variable, but the problem implies a floating set. Consider alternative framing. Trevor, watching from his seat, didn't understand what was happening. He saw Miss Aldridge's stillness. The way her face shifted, slowly, subtly, from passive interest to something else. Something closer to awe. For the first time, Trevor felt something foreign crawl into his chest. Doubt. He looked back at Jalaiah. She wasn't smiling this time. She was just waiting. Jalaiah submits the math packet the next morning, finished, annotated, and corrected. Ms. Aldridge had long ago mastered the art of suppressing surprise. In a school like Lakeshore Academy, where wealth, entitlement, and image walked hand in hand, teachers learned to lower expectations in silence. They weren't paid to challenge the status quo. They were paid to preserve it, to smile politely when the same 5 students dominated every discussion, to ignore the way certain names were always mispronounced, and certain voices always silenced. So when Jalaiah Brooks had entered her classroom, silent and unreadable, Miss Aldridge did what she had done for years. She made assumptions. Quiet meant overwhelmed. Stillness meant behind. A scholarship student meant remedial. She wasn't proud of those thoughts, but they were reflexive, etched into her by years of teaching in a system that rewarded mediocrity, wrapped in confidence. But now, she held a math packet in her hands that was quietly tearing those assumptions apart. She had stayed after school to read it again. Not skim it, study it. Every page felt like a revelation. Jalaiah hadn't just solved the problems. She'd rewritten the language of the problems themselves. On question 6, she challenged the foundational premise. On question 12, she proposed an alternate formula that wasn't just correct. It was elegant. There was no arrogance in her work, no attempt to impress. Just raw, untouched logic that hummed with clarity. Ms. Aldridge opened her laptop and ran segments through Turnitin, the school's plagiarism software. Nothing came up. No matches. No shared phrasing. No hints of pre-written formulas. It was all original. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, suddenly aware that something rare was unfolding. Not just in her classroom, but in front of her. She had underestimated a student who had been hiding in plain sight. Not because she lacked ability, but because she refused to perform for approval. For a long moment, Ms. Aldridge sat in silence, Then she opened her email and began typing a message to the academic committee. Not a report, but a recommendation. Julia's name would be submitted for independent study consideration, something rarely granted to juniors. But this wasn't about protocol anymore. This was about truth, and truth, when finally revealed, didn't ask for permission. The next morning, the hallways buzzed before the first bell rang. Whispers floated like smoke, impossible to contain. Word had spread that Miss Aldridge had lost her mind over the new girl's packet. Students traded exaggerations like currency. Some said she'd cried reading it. Others claimed Julia had exposed a mistake in the school's curriculum. It didn't matter what was true. What mattered was that for the first time, people were talking about Julia Brooks. Trevor heard the rumors as soon as he stepped on campus. Peyton rushed to him, breathless with gossip. She stayed after school, like hours. Going through that packet, Peyton said. They say she's like some math genius. Like actual genius. Trevor laughed it off at first. Shrugged. Called it a fluke. But beneath the chuckle, something sour brewed in his chest. It wasn't just that someone else had impressed Miss Aldridge. It was who had done it. A girl who didn't speak, who hadn't earned her place through charm or connections, who didn't even try. He found himself watching her again during homeroom. She sat in her usual seat, notebook open, head slightly tilted as if always thinking. She didn't react to the stares, didn't seem to notice that half the room was watching her with new curiosity, and the other half with suspicion. Trevor couldn't stand it. The idea that she might actually be better at something than him, that she might steal the spotlight without even reaching for it, burned him in a place he didn't have words for. He needed to fix it. Not privately. Not subtly. Publicly. That afternoon, as he walked past the school's trophy case, his eyes landed on the flyer for the upcoming Lakeshore Brain Bowl, the school's annual academic competition. It was a tradition drenched in showmanship, lights, audience, judges, and ego. It was a platform, a perfect one. Trevor didn't usually participate. He didn't need to. But this year he would. He pulled out his phone and opened Instagram. Within seconds, he was recording. He stood in front of the Brain Bowl poster, face smug, voice cocky.
This year's Brain Bowl's gonna be different, he said, the phone catching the gleam in his eye. Because I'm issuing a challenge. Julia Brooks, if you're really the genius everyone says you are, meet me on stage, one-on-one. Let's see what silence can really do.
He posted it instantly. Within minutes, it exploded. Students shared it. Teachers whispered about it. Even alumni chimed in. The quiet girl from nowhere was being called out on the loudest stage possible. The school watched for her response. But Julia said nothing. Not that day, not the next, not online, not in whispers. She continued attending classes, turning in assignments, taking notes. She didn't respond to the flood of messages in her inbox, or the stares in the hallway, or the passive-aggressive comments from students who resented the attention she now received. But something in her shifted. She began staying after class, not to ask questions, but to write on the whiteboard, when everyone else was gone. Miss Aldridge noticed. She left her door unlocked, quietly stepping out to give Julia the space she never asked for. One day, she returned to find the board filled with solutions she hadn't seen since graduate school. Not copied, created. The following week, Trevor approached the Brain Bowl committee. He pitched a revised format, a showcase match to open the event, one-on-one, spotlighted. The committee hesitated. It wasn't traditional, but when Trevor offered to have it live-streamed and promoted by his father's media team, they agreed. The announcement was made during Monday assembly. The auditorium echoed as the principal declared the opening match. Trevor Maddox versus Julia Brooks. Gasps. Murmurs. Laughter. And finally, stillness. Julia sat in the second row. She didn't flinch. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. But her pencil moved. She was already writing. Trevor announces a public academic showdown during the school-wide Brain Bowl. He dares Julia to go head-to-head. By midweek, Lakeshore Academy no longer felt like a school. It had become a coliseum. Every corridor, locker, and screen seemed to echo the same phrase, Trevor versus the transfer. The Brain Bowl had transformed overnight into a spectacle. Posters covered walls, windows, and even bathroom stalls. Flyers were handed out during lunch. The school's social media page had even changed its banner to a custom-designed face-off image. Trevor, arms crossed, smirking under a spotlight. A silhouette opposite him, nameless but unmistakably female, standing in the shadows. Jelia's name didn't even need to be mentioned. She was the transfer, the outsider, the anomaly, the target. Even students who rarely cared about academics were suddenly energized. The competition had been rebranded into something primal, a battle between legacy and disruption. Trevor was the school's golden boy, homegrown, connected, loud. Jelia was the quiet challenge to that legacy, and her refusal to play the game only made her more polarizing. Announcements about the Brain Bowl played during homeroom, voiced with exaggerated drama. Will brains triumph over boldness? Will silence speak louder than ego? This Friday, it all goes down. Laughter erupted each time. Students nudged each other, rolled their eyes, shouted Trevor's name down the halls. His face had become synonymous with the event, and Trevor played his part to perfection. He walked through campus like a celebrity. He wore custom t-shirts that read, "Crowned before the bowl." He high-fived underclassmen, gave impromptu interviews for the school's news stream, and handed out Team Trevor wristbands during lunch. Confidence radiated off him like heat. Yet something subtle began to rot under the surface. Because for all his showmanship, Trevor couldn't shake one thing. Jelia wasn't responding. Not once, not a word, not a smirk, not even a glance at the posters. She walked the halls with the same quiet poise, her notebook clutched tightly, her eyes focused straight ahead. If she saw the memes, she didn't show it. If she heard the whispers, she never flinched. Even when two seniors mockingly offered her a toy calculator at lunch, she simply placed it gently on the table and walked away. To most, that silence looked like fear. To Trevor, it was something worse. Control. He tried to laugh it off. She's gonna choke, he told Peyton between classes. Bet she won't even show. But the doubt was growing. Late at night, when the clapping stopped and the cameras faded, Trevor sat at his desk, buried in textbooks he barely understood. He ran through equations like a machine, desperate to memorize shortcuts, tricks, anything that could guarantee him a win. He paid a tutor $120 an hour to walk him through practice problems. And still, none of it felt like enough. Because the truth gnawed at him in moments of quiet. Jelia wasn't preparing to win the Brain Bowl. She was always prepared. That's what scared him. Trevor's confidence had always been performance. And this time, the stage lights were too bright. Meanwhile, the student body wasn't just watching. They were choosing sides. Some cheered for Trevor because they always had. He was the symbol of everything. Lakeshore rewarded charm, presence, legacy. Others began rooting for Jelia quietly, discreetly. Students who'd once ignored her started paying attention. They noticed the way she always knew the answers, but never raised her hand. The way she annotated her textbooks with questions that went beyond the curriculum. She never asked for recognition. But recognition was beginning to arrive anyway. Still, the cruelty continued. Online, Jelia became a target of digital mockery. A meme showed her face edited next to the word mute button. Another, darker one, featured her image with the caption, "Silence is golden, until you get embarrassed." The school administration did nothing. Trevor reposted several of the memes, laughing alongside his followers. His comment sections were filled with gifs of mic drops and exaggerated reactions. "She ain't ready," one comment read. "Friday's gonna be a massacre." But what no one noticed was this. While the memes multiplied, Jelia's notebooks did too. She now carried 3, each one filled with dense layers of equations, abstract structures, and theoretical maps. Trevor caught a glimpse once, just a flicker, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. She wasn't solving problems. She was designing them. Still, the school pushed the spectacle forward. Trevor even convinced the Brain Bowl committee to approve a mini promo video. In it, he stood in front of the camera, voice confident, tone mocking. "Lakeshore's about excellence. Let's make sure the quiet ones know that showing up isn't the same as measuring up." The video was posted on the school's homepage. Staff didn't stop it. Students shared it. Some laughed. Others winced. Jelia didn't blink. But inside the silence, something had shifted. That Thursday afternoon, one day before the event, Trevor lingered after school in the library. He wasn't studying. He was spiraling. The formulas weren't sticking. The tricks felt flimsy. His hands were clammy. The auditorium had been decorated for the event. Lights, seating, even a broadcast team. There would be parents, alumni, donors, and her. He passed Ms. Aldridge's classroom on his way out. The door was slightly ajar. She was on the phone. standing by her desk, speaking in a tone Trevor had never heard from her. Soft, unfiltered, admiring. He paused in the hallway, just beyond view. Yes. She finished the entire packet, Ms. Aldridge said quietly. And not just solved it. She reshaped the logic of several problems. Offered alternate routes to solutions I hadn't considered in years. The voice on the other end asked something he couldn't hear. Ms. Aldridge responded, slower this time. I've never seen a mind like hers in 20 years. It's not just intelligence, it's precision, purpose. She doesn't solve to impress. She solves because it's how she breathes. Trevor's face flushed. His throat tightened. The silence that followed wasn't just uncomfortable. It was suffocating. He turned away and walked down the corridor without making a sound. And for the first time, he wasn't angry. He was scared. The day before the brain bowl, Trevor overhears Miss Aldridge on a phone call. I've never seen a mind like hers in 20 years. Friday's light filtered in through the cafeteria's tall glass panels, casting long, sterile beams over the sea of students buzzing with anticipation. The energy in the room wasn't about food. It was spectacle. The brain bowl was just hours away, and every conversation carried some version of the same topic. Would she show up? Would she embarrass herself? Would Trevor finally shut her down for good? Trevor sat at his usual table, the one in the center where the socially untouchable ruled. Laughter surrounded him, but his own smile was thin, rehearsed. The conversation flowed, but his ears kept picking up the scattered mentions of Jalaya. Always Jalaya. Whispers about her notebook, her stare, her stillness. She hadn't spoken once this week. Not a single word. And yet, she was winning the attention. Trevor's fork paused over his untouched tray. Every time he tried to joke about it, he felt something grip his lungs. The image of Miss Aldridge's voice haunted him still. I've never seen a mind like hers in 20 years. It wasn't fair. He had done everything right. He had built the hype. He'd made her the villain of his stage. And still she refused to crumble. Her silence wasn't absence. It was a mirror. And Trevor hated what it was starting to reflect back at him. He needed to regain control. And control, for Trevor Maddox, had always come easiest when delivered in front of a crowd. Across the cafeteria, Jalaya stood in line alone. Same posture, same quiet. She moved with a stillness that felt intentional now. Like she wasn't just walking, but watching, measuring, absorbing. That unnerved him. He rose from his seat, ignored Peyton's warning glance, and strode toward her, tray in hand. He knew eyes were already watching. That was the point. He passed table after table, the murmurs growing with each step. When he reached her, the entire junior class had turned to look. Jalaya looked up just as he stopped in front of her. Her expression didn't change. No confusion, no fear. Trevor smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. So, he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. Big day, huh? You ready to get schooled in front of the entire district? Jalaya didn't respond. She didn't even blink. He tilted his head. Oh right. I forgot. Silence is your whole thing. Makes sense though. When you're used to being overlooked, it probably just feels normal. A few students chuckled uneasily. Others went still. Even Peyton shifted in his seat. Uncomfortable now. Trevor leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for intimacy, but just loud enough to carry. You know, we all saw those shoes. Scuffed up like they came from a donation box. And that backpack thing's falling apart. I guess they don't teach presentation where you're from. Just street smarts, right? Still no reaction. Trevor straightened up, pulling something from his pocket. It was a handful of fake dollar bills, the kind from novelty shops. Bright green, cartoonish. He tossed them at her feet. They'll come in handy after you drop out tonight, he said with a grin. You know, for the bus ride back to wherever they scraped you up from. The cafeteria went dead quiet. The bills fluttered around her sneakers like leaves. Some landed on her tray. Others slid across the polished floor. Students gawked, some stunned, some entertained, most silent. Jalaya stood still. The entire room watched, holding its breath, waiting for the crack, the flinch, the breakdown. But she didn't move. She looked down at the bills. Then slowly, deliberately, she looked up at Trevor. No anger, no panic, just the same measured expression. Then wordlessly, she stepped over the bills, walked past him, and carried her tray to the far side of the cafeteria. The silence that followed wasn't supportive. It was stunned. Even Trevor felt it. A subtle shift in the air, not triumph, not applause. just the cold weight of something wrong. Across the room, two students whispered, "He took it too far." Another muttered, "That wasn't cool." Peyton, pale, kept his eyes down. Trevor stood in the center, frozen. And for the first time in his life, surrounded by an audience, he didn't feel powerful. He felt exposed. Julia sat alone at a table by the window, eating slowly, calmly, as if nothing had happened. But those who watched her closely saw it. The pause between bites, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped her fork a little too hard. She wasn't unaffected. She was enduring. That night, her apartment was quiet, except for the scratching of a dry erase marker against her whiteboard. It was small, propped up on two milk crates, its surface worn down from hours of previous calculations. Earlier in the week, it had been filled top to bottom with formulas, diagrams, and test problems she'd been preparing for the Brain Bowl. But now Julia stood before it with a different energy, her face calm, but her eyes sharper than ever. In one sweeping motion, she erased everything. Every theorem, every equation, every plan, gone. She stood in front of the now blank board, staring at it for several long seconds. Then she picked up the marker again, and in thick black strokes, she wrote a single question. What do they fear most? She stepped back and stared at it. The night wind rattled the window. Somewhere downstairs, a television blared. A siren cried in the distance. But in her room, there was only stillness, and a question that carried more fire than 1,000 answers. That night, Julia erases an entire whiteboard of equations in her bedroom and replaces them with just one question. The auditorium at Lakeshore Academy pulsed with tension. Every seat was taken, and the atmosphere crackled with anticipation, more like a championship game than an academic event. Parents leaned forward in their chairs. Teachers whispered behind clipboards. A local news crew adjusted camera angles in the corner, prepping for what had now become the most anticipated Brain Bowl in the school's history. It was no longer a test of knowledge. It was a public showdown, one crafted from weeks of quiet tension and mounting spectacle. On stage, two desks stood opposite each other beneath warm amber lighting. Name placards and microphones were neatly arranged. Behind them, a towering projection screen displayed the countdown. Judges sat in a row off to the side, wearing earpieces and scanning rule sheets. The principal stepped to the mic to address the crowd, but no one was truly listening. Not yet. All eyes were on the curtain. Trevor emerged first, met with thunderous applause. His swagger was theatrical. He soaked in the cheers, pumped his fist, and spun into his chair like a celebrity. His uniform was pristine, his hair gelled to perfection, and his sneakers practically glowed. From the front row, his father nodded with smug approval, arms crossed like a man watching his investment unfold. Trevor threw a wink to the cameras and leaned back with a wide grin, soaking in the moment as if he'd already won. Then the room shifted. Julia stepped out from the wings without ceremony, walking calmly across the stage. No nods, no waves, just quiet steps. Her uniform was plain, her braid tight, and her notebook tucked beneath one arm. She sat down without a sound, head slightly bowed, her expression unreadable. The crowd didn't cheer, but they didn't look away. A hush settled over the auditorium that felt heavier than silence. Her presence wasn't showy, but it commanded. The principal welcomed everyone and laid out the rules. 3 rounds: logic fundamentals, applied calculus, and abstract problem solving. Answers would be judged based on accuracy, time, and method. The screen flashed the first question. The timer blinked to 30 minutes. Round 1 began. A train leaves Station A at 60 miles per hour. 30 minutes later, another train leaves Station B at 75. Before the final word was read aloud, Trevor was scribbling. His pencil darted across the page. Performance in every line. He finished in under a minute, holding up his answer proudly. 90 miles. The crowd applauded. The judges confirmed correct. Julia sat still. She looked at the screen, then at her paper, and then, without writing anything, she slid her paper forward. Blank. A judge leaned toward his mic. "Miss Brooks?" Julia looked up calmly. "Pass." The word sent a ripple through the audience. Whispers surged. Trevor smirked and chuckled under his breath. "She's folding already," he muttered. The second question came. Trevor answered. "Correct." Julia passed again. The third followed. Same result. When the round ended, Trevor had a perfect score. Julia had nothing. The murmurs grew louder now. Even students who had admired Jalaya's poise began to shift uncomfortably. Teachers whispered. The cameras zoomed in. Headlines were already forming in the minds of the media. Quiet transfer cracks under pressure. But Miss Aldridge, seated near the judge's table, didn't blink. She watched Elias' every breath, every muscle, every second of calculated stillness. She wasn't choking. She was choosing. Then round 2 began. The first calculus problem appeared on the screen. A particle moves along a line with position function st. Trevor's brow furrowed. He started solving, muttering through the steps. He paused, rewrote, crossed something out. T1, he finally said. Minimum point. The judges frowned. Incorrect. Please try again. Jalaya remained motionless for a few more seconds. Then, without changing expression, she picked up her pencil and wrote one clean line. She slid her answer forward without hesitation. The judge blinked. His eyes scanned the solution. Then he turned to the others. A beat of silence passed before the head judge leaned into the mic. Correct. The auditorium went still. Trevor blinked, then leaned forward. I want to see her work, he snapped. That's the rule. One of the judges cleared his throat. Her method was valid. The solution was completed using a recognized identity. Minimal steps. Acceptable. Trevor's mouth opened, then closed. He'd never heard of that rule before. Jalaya just waited. The second calculus question appeared. A volume rate problem. Trevor answered. Nearly correct. But his units were off. Half credit. Jalaya answered again with a single line. Correct. This time, no one in the room laughed. By the end of round 2, the scoreboard had flipped. Trevor. Jalaya. It wasn't a landslide. But it wasn't luck either. Now the crowd was watching for something else. Their cheers turned to silence. Their jokes turned to awe. Because Jalaya hadn't just arrived. She was leading. And she hadn't even opened her notebook. Trevor sat stiffly in his chair, his palms slick, heart racing. He wasn't used to losing. Not in public. Not like this. And especially not to someone who hadn't said more than 2 words all week. His grin had vanished. His posture changed. He could feel it. The stage lights were suddenly too hot. The noise too loud. Her silence too heavy. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He was trying not to drown. Trevor demands to see her work. But there's no work shown, just a single correct answer. The silence that followed round 2 wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. A shift had taken place inside the auditorium. It was no longer about Jalaya catching up, or Trevor holding his ground. It was about something no one had prepared for: reversal. The very architecture of the school's power dynamic had tilted, and it had done so without a single raised voice or celebratory cheer. Trevor sat rigid in his chair, eyes darting between the scoreboard and the crowd. His once bright confidence had dimmed under the weight of confusion. He had underestimated her. Everyone had. And now, they were all beginning to realize what that meant. Jalaya, on the other hand, didn't move. She hadn't shifted in her seat since she arrived on stage. Her notebook remained closed beside her. Her pencil rested neatly across her paper, untouched since the start of the competition. And yet she led the score. The judges whispered among themselves as the principal stepped up to the microphone. Final round, he announced. Abstract problem solving. 1 question. Unlimited time. Full points awarded for accuracy and method. This question has stumped even our top state champions. You will each receive 1 opportunity. Begin when ready. The screen went black for a moment. Then a single problem appeared in bold white text. Let fx be a continuous function such that fx be x quarta. Determine fx. A collective breath sucked in across the audience. Even the teachers in the crowd looked visibly shaken. It wasn't just complex. It was unapproachable. A recursive function masked inside a quadratic. A trick designed to derail even advanced university students. The kind of question that didn't just require knowledge, it required vision. Trevor's throat went dry. He stared at the question like it was written in another language. His hand gripped his pencil so tightly it trembled. He looked down, then up again, tried to start writing, scratched out a few numbers, then paused. His heart raced, sweat started beading along his forehead. He erased, rewrote, erased again. Minutes passed. He looked to the judges. No help. Looked at the crowd. Too much pressure. Looked at his notes. Useless. Jalaya finally looked at the screen. She didn't flinch. She didn't glance at the crowd, didn't look toward the judges, didn't even look at Trevor. She simply read the question once, then closed her eyes. 30 seconds passed. The audience waited, breath held, watching for a sign, any sign that she was as stumped as Trevor. But then, slowly, she picked up her pencil and wrote a single line, one line. Then she placed her pencil down. The judges leaned forward instantly. One of them walked to her table, picked up the page, and scanned it. Then he stopped breathing. The other two judges moved in. One of them blinked hard, reading again and again. Whispering began among them. The head judge stood abruptly, paper in hand, and stepped toward the side of the stage. He leaned toward Miss Aldridge, who listened intently, her eyes suddenly wide. Something had happened, something seismic. The auditorium was dead silent, the tension suffocating. Trevor noticed the panic rising in the judge's expressions. He tried to stand, to see her paper, but a faculty member motioned him to sit. The energy shifted from spectacle to sacred. Even the camera crew stopped recording for a moment, unsure whether to keep filming what looked more like history than competition. Whispers grew louder at the judges' table. Phrases like impossible, original derivation, pure function began floating around. One of the judges began typing on a laptop, cross-referencing known mathematical identities, trying to confirm what they had just seen. Trevor sat frozen. He'd barely written 2 legible steps, and she'd solved it in a single line. The principal stepped back on stage, speaking quietly into his mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're verifying an unprecedented submission. Please remain patient." But the audience was anything but calm. The air had shifted again, first anticipation, then disbelief. And now it was reverence. Jalaiah didn't move. She simply reached for her pencil case, slid her pencil inside, zipped it shut, and placed it next to her notebook. Then slowly, she turned her head and looked directly at Trevor. For the first time, their eyes locked. No rage, no triumph, no arrogance, just clarity. Then she spoke. Just one sentence. "Check your assumptions." The microphone didn't catch her words, but Trevor heard them. He heard every syllable, and it shattered him. Because deep down, in that precise moment, he realized it had never been about the question, or the crowd, or the competition. It had been about truth. And the truth was this. He had spent weeks preparing to humiliate someone who had already surpassed him before the first question had even been asked. Jalaiah closes her pencil case, looks directly at Trevor for the first time, and says, "Check your assumption." By the time the sun set that evening, Jalaiah Brooks's name had become a headline, a 60-second TikTok clip, capturing the moment she closed her pencil case and delivered 4 quiet words to Trevor Maddox, had been reposted over 100,000 times. The video, blurry and handheld, had caught something more than just a math competition. It had captured a reckoning, the kind of still, seismic shift that doesn't rely on shouting to change the ground beneath it. As the words "check your assumptions" echoed through speakers and stitched TikToks, the world outside Lakeshore Academy began to take notice. The first wave of attention came fast and celebratory. Edited videos appeared with slow motion and cinematic music overlays. Captions praised her silence, her precision, her calm. "Silent genius, shocks elite school." One trending headline read, "Scholarship girl solves what state champs couldn't," said another. Jalaiah had not just won a competition, she had dismantled a narrative. For a moment, the attention shimmered with reverence. She was being compared to prodigies, quoted on tech blogs, and even tagged by Ivy League students admiring her poise. But by morning, the tone had begun to change. Scrutiny arrived the way it always does, quiet at first, then relentless. Internet trolls found old pictures on her mother's Facebook page, images from birthdays in a small apartment, photos of dollar store decorations, and off-brand cereal boxes. They screenshot them, mocked them, posted them beneath videos of her Brain Bowl performance with captions like, "Math genius but can't afford real shoes," or "Still ghetto." Comments filled with suspicion and contempt began to overtake the praise. "No way she did this on her own," one user wrote. "Come on, someone gave her the answers." Another added, "Affirmative action strikes again." The story had shifted, not because the facts had changed, but because her identity remained too threatening to leave unquestioned. She was too black, too quiet, too poor, too perfect. She hadn't just won, she had done it without asking permission. And for some, that was unforgivable. Jalaiah didn't respond to any of it. She didn't post. She didn't comment. She didn't change her routine. But her mother saw it. She called Jelaya into the living room that evening, her voice tight with fear. She didn't show the posts, but her eyes told the story. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked, voice trembling. Jelaya nodded, her face still. "I'm fine," she said, but her chest burned with a pain she didn't have the luxury to name. Meanwhile, Trevor had disappeared from public view. The boy who once lived online had gone dark. No stories, no tweets, no jokes. His followers waited for his spin, but nothing came. His face had gone viral too, not for his performance but for the split-second moment his expression cracked when Jelaya spoke to him. The look, they called it. Screenshots flooded the internet. Wide eyes, clenched jaw. The very second he realized the story had slipped out of his hand, it became a meme. He became a punchline. But inside the Maddox home, the mood was anything but humorous. Charles Maddox, Trevor's father, responded not with silence, but strategy, infuriated that his son had been humiliated on stage by a girl who shouldn't have even been in that room. He filed a formal complaint with the school board. He didn't mention her name, but his language was surgical. Violation of fair academic procedure. Suspicion of external assistance. Unverified methodology. It didn't need to name her. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. Mrs. Aldridge was the first to see the document. It arrived in her inbox early Friday morning, cold and clinical. She read it twice before folding it into her desk drawer and staring out the classroom window. She'd seen this before many times. She had watched gifted students of color be praised one moment and doubted the next, but never had she seen it happen so quickly, so publicly, or so viciously. By the afternoon, Lakeshore's administration had scheduled a private meeting. No students invited, no press, but the purpose was clear. Contain the narrative, limit the damage, reassert control. Jelaya wasn't informed. She wasn't asked to speak. Her name wasn't on the agenda. But her future was being discussed. That night, she went to the school rooftop. It wasn't dramatic, just necessary. She needed air, silence, perspective. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest, watching the sky darken above the town that had made her a spectacle. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. But something inside her shifted. She had followed the rules. She had outworked everyone. She had said nothing, answered everything, and still they came for her. The next morning, a black sedan appeared outside her apartment building. The man who stepped out was tall, pale, and wore a suit too polished for the neighborhood. He stood by the steps, holding a thin briefcase and a small notepad. He didn't knock. He didn't call ahead. He waited. Jelaya came down the stairs, her backpack over one shoulder, earbuds in, ready for another day of quiet. He stepped in front of her path. "Jelaya Brooks?" he asked. She stopped. The man flipped open the notepad. "I've been retained by an external academic review board," he said, voice flat, "to investigate recent results from a competitive event at Lakeshore Academy. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Jelaya blinked. He turned a page in his file and looked at her directly. "Let's start here," he said. "How did you learn all this?" A private investigator shows up at Jelaya's house, asking how she learned all this. The man in the tailored suit left after 32 minutes. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't accused her directly. But every question he asked came layered with something darker than suspicion. It came with intent. Intent to expose, to discredit, to imply wrongdoing without ever stating it outright. "How long have you been studying math at this level? Did anyone in the school give you early access to the problem? Do you have a tutor outside Lakeshore, someone who may have assisted you?" Jelaya's responses were calm, short, factual. But the damage wasn't in the words. It was in the posture. The man had stood the whole time, as if she were on trial. Her mother seated nearby grew visibly tense. She kept her arms crossed, foot tapping rhythmically, resisting every urge to interrupt. Not once did the man ask about her method, her thought process, or her goals, only about access, advantage, legitimacy. When he finally closed his file and offered a dry "thank you for your time," he didn't look her in the eyes. He didn't need to. The message had been sent. By Monday, the investigation had become formal. The school called it a standard academic integrity check, but no other students from the Brain Bowl were asked to re-perform their problems. Only Jelaya. She was instructed to attend a private evaluation in a cold, fluorescent-lit conference room, usually reserved for disciplinary hearings. Waiting inside were 3 evaluators, Middle-aged, white, and each with a laptop and clipboard in front of them. No Ms. Aldridge, no other faculty advocates, no witnesses, just her. They didn't greet her with warmth. They nodded briefly, then gestured toward a whiteboard. One of them cleared his throat and said, "Let's begin." They started with a basic question, clearly to bait her into nervousness. She solved it in 8 seconds. The second question was calculus-based. She didn't even sit. She stood before the board and worked through it, step by step, narrating not with arrogance but with surgical clarity. By the third question, a recursive function more complex than the one from the brain bowl, the evaluators began exchanging glances, not the kind of glances shared when confirming brilliance, but the kind that carried an uncomfortable truth. She was beyond their expectation, beyond the scope of their framework. Still, their tone remained flat. "Can you prove you arrived at this independently?" She turned, dry markers still in hand. "I just did." There was no reply. She answered all 10 questions. Clean, direct, accurate. No notes, no coaching, no hesitation. When it was over, they didn't praise her. They didn't thank her. They simply dismissed her with a nod and a, "We'll be in touch." She walked out without looking back. Ms. Aldridge was waiting outside. The moment she saw Jalia's face, calm but cold, something inside her snapped. That afternoon, Ms. Aldridge did what most teachers at Lakeshore never dared. She spoke publicly. During staff briefing, with department heads present, she raised her hand and said, "The way we've treated Jalia Brooks is not about academic integrity. It's about threat perception." Heads turned. Some eyes widened. A few teachers looked down at their desks. "She passed every test," Ms. Aldridge continued. "Not because she got help, not because she cheated, but because she's brilliant. And we don't know how to handle brilliance when it's wrapped in black skin and quiet strength." The room fell silent. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It cut anyway. The administrators thanked her for sharing, then moved on without response. But something had That week, other black students at Lakeshore began speaking out, quietly at first, then louder. A sophomore named Trinity posted a story about being called articulate after every presentation, like it was a surprise. A senior, Malik, tweeted that his test papers were always returned with "recheck your steps" comments, even when they were correct. Another student shared that she had been randomly searched 3 times more than her white peers during locker sweeps. The stories multiplied. Not all of them went viral, but they reached the halls. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Jalia anymore. It was about a pattern, one that had never been documented, but always lived in the margins. Students of color began walking with new posture. Not because they felt safe, but because they finally felt seen. And that made them dangerous, in the eyes of those who preferred silence. The school board, feeling pressure from both sides, parents demanding Jalia be punished, and growing student unrest, made a decision. They called it temporary suspension pending academic review. No prior notice, no hearing, no conversation. Just a single envelope handed to Jalia during her final period. She read the letter at her desk. One sentence stood out. "Effective immediately, you are suspended from Lakeshore Academy until the completion of the academic integrity investigation." There was no signature, just a stamp. As she folded the paper, her classmates looked on, some confused, some silently triumphant. She stood, packed her notebook, and walked out the door. The halls were quiet as she passed through them, each step echoing a truth too many had already known. When black brilliance becomes undeniable, the system doesn't reward it. It isolates it. Jalia is suspended pending academic integrity review. It started with a local headline, "Top student suspended amidst academic integrity investigation." But by noon, it had evolved into something else, something national, something combustible. Within 24 hours of her suspension, Jalia's name began appearing on news tickers across the country. Major outlets picked up the story, some with curiosity, others with judgment. They all used the same sanitized language: ongoing investigation, concerns raised by school administration, unprecedented performance by a scholarship student. The details remained vague, but the subtext didn't need translation. Social media, already primed by the viral Brain Bowl clip, exploded again. But this time, the tone had changed. What was once praise for a brilliant girl's triumph had become a battlefield. Some commenters doubled down, knew it was too good to be true. Others defended her fiercely. They'll forgive a rich white boy for cheating, but a black girl solving an equation is called suspicious. Civil rights organizations began weighing in. The National Black Students Collective issued a formal statement condemning the suspension. Lawyers from two separate advocacy groups contacted Jeliah's family, offering free legal representation. Hashtags formed. Let Jeliah learn. Protect Black excellence. She did the work. But while her name rose in the public consciousness, her life at home was unraveling. Jeliah's mother, Angela, had always worked quietly behind the scenes, night shifts at the regional hospital, overtime on weekends, second jobs when needed. She had been proud of her daughter's silence, her discipline, her clarity, but now, the silence felt dangerous. Reporters began showing up outside their building. One tried to follow Jeliah from the grocery store. Another left a voicemail at the front desk of the hospital where Angela worked. That same week, her supervisor called her into the office. "I'm sorry," the woman said, eyes flickering. "There's too much heat. Too much media attention." Angela was terminated the next morning. No severance. No warning. Just like that, the system took its second swing. At school, Trevor watched the chaos from a distance. He didn't return to social media, but he didn't need to. He watched the headlines unfold like a movie he used to star in, but no longer controlled. His father, Charles, pushed for him to speak publicly, to set the record straight, to remind people what's fair. So he did. Trevor appeared in a local TV interview, wearing a neutral sweater, hair neatly styled, sitting between his parents on a velvet couch in their home library. The lighting was soft. His tone was careful. "I just wanted the rules to be followed," he said, eyes slightly lowered. "It was never personal. I respect Jeliah's intelligence. But when you're in a competition, it's supposed to be equal. All I asked for was fairness." The clip aired during prime time. The internet tore it apart. In the comments, viewers posted screenshots of Trevor's own academic history, which had recently leaked through anonymous sources. He had failed 2 major exams during the semester, one in math, one in chemistry. He had been flagged for plagiarism once, and yet he remained untouched. No disciplinary review, no academic penalties, no media stories. One teacher had reportedly altered his grades to maintain eligibility for athletics. Another had deleted a late assignment from the grading system altogether. The contradiction was no longer a whisper. It was documented. Still, the school board doubled down. They insisted on a thorough investigation, despite the lack of evidence against Jeliah. They delayed her reinstatement. Worse, her academic record was frozen. Without clearance from Lakeshore's administration, her transcripts could not be released to colleges. Early applications were blocked. Recommendation letters were rescinded. Every acceptance email she had received now ended with a sterile follow-up, pending verification of academic standing. Her future, once sharpened like a blade, was suddenly placed in limbo. And Jeliah? She didn't break. But she did go quiet. Not the quiet of strategy or patience. This was the quiet of fatigue. The kind that came from watching every step forward, met with institutional walls. The kind of silence that creeps into your bones and makes you question if the fight is even worth it. Ms. Aldridge saw it. She watched Jeliah's posture change, her eyes dull slightly, her presence shrink. And that's when she decided she'd had enough. For over a decade, Ms. Aldridge had worked inside the walls of Lakeshore, compiling data no one else cared to examine. She had seen black students placed in lower tracks despite test scores. She had read teacher notes with words like aggressive and uncooperative for students who merely asked questions. She had kept copies of emails discreetly carefully, because something inside her knew a day like this would come. And now it had. That night, she unlocked a private folder on her home computer labeled Evidence. It contained 10 years of records, grading disparities, behavior referrals, academic warnings, complaint patterns that painted a clear, undeniable picture. Black students at Lakeshore were being held to different standards. She didn't share it with administrators. She leaked it. An anonymous Dropbox link appeared in the inbox of a local education journalist. Within hours, the documents were verified. Within days, the story broke. Exclusive. Leaked records show systemic bias against black students at Lakeshore Academy. Screenshots of teacher comments flooded Twitter. Pie charts showing grading gaps were reposted on Instagram. One file showed that in a 10-year period, no white student had ever been suspended for academic dishonesty. Not once. Jeliah wasn't an anomaly. She was a threat to the lie. Ms. Aldridge leaks internal documents showing bias against black students over 10 years. The morning the article broke, Lakeshore Academy awoke to a version of itself it could no longer ignore. The leaked documents were everywhere. On phones, on news screens, on printer paper taped to lockers. Charts highlighted decade-long disparities in grading trends. Attendance discipline, test re-evaluation requests, quotes from internal teacher communications, exposed assumptions made not in anger but in arrogance. One comment read, "He's too advanced for where he comes from. Someone's probably doing the work for him." Another, "She's not aggressive, just a little too confident for her background." The truth wasn't whispered anymore. It was published. Miss Eldridge was named the anonymous whistleblower by mid-morning. Though she hadn't spoken publicly, her colleagues knew. The tension in the teacher's lounge was suffocating. Some glared, some avoided eye contact. A few offered hushed thank yous, whispered as if the air itself might snitch. By lunchtime, the district had already launched an internal review. That afternoon, Miss Aldridge received an email from the State Board of Education's legal office, requesting a formal deposition. She didn't hesitate. When she arrived at the district courthouse, she wore a dark blazer and carried a box of printouts, data, notes, timelines, everything she had watched build up over the years, all the injustices she could no longer stomach in silence. She sat alone in a room with 4 lawyers and a recorder, her back straight, her tone measured. She testified that Jelaya Brooks had completed all her work independently. She testified that her performance in the Brain Bowl was consistent with her classroom excellence. She testified that no white student had ever been asked to re-perform work under suspicion, not even when caught using online tools without permission. And then she did more than testify. She accused. She named administrators who had quietly instructed teachers to adjust grades to maintain image. She described faculty meetings where black students were referred to as statistical outliers and where requests for more advanced placement opportunities were met with patronizing smiles. It wasn't a testimony. It was a reckoning. News cameras caught her walking out of the courthouse. She didn't speak to reporters. She didn't wave. She just walked with purpose. Straight back, jaw tight, eyes forward. By the next day, the district confirmed a federal inquiry was underway. And Jelaya? She watched it all from the corner of her living room, knees hugged to her chest, face dimly lit by the television. Her mother sat beside her, one hand resting gently on her daughter's back. "You're not alone anymore," her mother said softly. Jelaya didn't answer, but she felt it, that weight, that crushing, suffocating weight, that had wrapped around her since the moment Trevor threw those fake bills at her feet, was finally lifting. It didn't vanish, but it loosened, and in that space, something returned. Focus. That same week, a representative from the mathematics department at Melton University, a highly regarded research college just one town over, reached out. They had seen the footage, they had reviewed her Brain Bowl solutions, and they had an idea, a challenge. A live problem-solving exhibition, held in front of a panel of university faculty, open to the public. It wasn't a test for her. It was a test for the institution. Could the girl they tried to silence hold her own under academic scrutiny? Could she rewrite the rules again, but this time, in front of the very people who claimed to protect them? Jelaya said yes, not because she had something to prove, but because she didn't want them rewriting her story without her. The auditorium at Melton University was less grand than Lakeshore's, but colder, more clinical. No stage lights, just rows of university chairs, a plain whiteboard, a panel of judges, and a modest crowd of professors, students, and observers. No parents, no classmates, no cheering, just math. And she stood in front of the board in jeans and a hoodie, her braids pulled back, her notebook untouched on the table beside her. A moderator read the first question. It was brutal, layers deep in advanced statistical modeling. Jelaya read it once, then picked up a marker. She began writing, not just solving but explaining. Her voice was calm, clipped, and focused. She didn't ask for pauses. She didn't stammer. She just moved, word by word, variable by variable, tearing through complexity like it was made of thread. Then came a second problem. Then a third. Each one harder than the last. Each one met with the same unblinking focus. At the end, the room didn't erupt in applause. It simply sat still, because brilliance, when it reveals itself without apology, does not always inspire celebration. Sometimes it silences the room. The proctor stepped forward as she set down the marker, a tall, older man with graying hair and a skeptical posture. He approached her slowly, clipboard under one arm, Excellent work, he said quietly. Then, from inside his folder, he pulled a small envelope, plain, white, with one sentence printed across the front. Do not open until after. He handed it to her without explanation. The university proctor quietly slides her an envelope labeled Do not open until after. The envelope sat untouched in her lap for hours. Jalaiah hadn't opened it on stage. She hadn't opened it in the hallway. She hadn't opened it in the car ride home, though her mother kept glancing at it like it held a detonator. It was too much, too fast. The white paper with the typed label, Do not open until after, felt less like a reward and more like a test, like someone was still watching, still measuring her reaction, still determining what kind of black girl she was going to be. She waited until midnight. Her apartment was silent, lit only by the dim glow of the kitchen light, left on for comfort. She sat at the table where she had spent countless nights hunched over equations, where silence had become her sharpest weapon. She slid her fingers under the flap. Inside was a folded letter on embossed Melton University stationery. At the top, one sentence in bold, We believe in minds like yours. Below it, in careful paragraphs, the offer was spelled out, full scholarship, full academic autonomy, research mentorship, early admission, housing, a stipend, a seat in the most elite math cohort in the region, not because of her story, not because of the headlines, but because of her mind. Her eyes didn't water. She didn't gasp. She just breathed, deep, long, and then stared at the words for a very long time. Because it was everything she had worked for. And still, it wasn't enough to undo the damage. The next morning, the legal case hit its peak. Civil rights attorneys representing Jalaiah and other current and former Lakeshore students filed a class action lawsuit against the school district. The claims weren't just about her suspension. They were about patterns, generational discrimination, documentation of systemic obstruction. It made national headlines. Jalaiah's story became a symbol, but the lawsuit made her dangerous. That afternoon, her legal team sat her down and offered a decision. We can take this all the way, the lead attorney said. What was done to you wasn't just unethical, it was unlawful. If we pursue full damages, the school board could be held liable for millions. You'd be compensated for defamation, emotional trauma, academic loss. Angela, her mother, sat beside her, nodding silently. But Jalaiah didn't answer. Because beneath the offer, beneath the possibility of financial retribution, a new fear crept in. She didn't want her legacy to be just a courtroom victory. She wanted it to be her mind, her work, her name without an asterisk. And yet was silence again, a form of surrender? Was grace just another way they expected her to clean up their mess? 2 days later, a press conference was held outside the Lakeshore District office. Journalists packed the space. Protesters lined the sidewalks with signs. She did the work. This is bigger than math. Protect black students. Jalaiah arrived in a gray blazer over her hoodie. Her mother walked beside her, flanked by lawyers. Cameras flashed. Microphones reached forward. She took her seat at the panel table. Ms. Aldridge was there, seated to her right. The atmosphere pulsed with tension. The moderator welcomed the press and gave a brief overview of the case, the investigation, the evidence leaked, and the lawsuit now filed. Then, they opened the floor to questions. A journalist from a national outlet stood up. His voice was soft but direct. Jalaiah, if you could say one thing to Trevor Maddox right now, what would it be? The room stilled. That was the moment they'd all been waiting for. The revenge quote. The viral moment. The righteous anger. Jalaiah leaned forward, her hands folded neatly. She paused. 1 second. 2. 3. And then she spoke. It's not about Trevor anymore. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched. Eyebrows lifted. Because no one had expected that. She continued, her voice calm but resolute. It was never just about one boy mocking one girl. It was about who gets to be seen as brilliant, who gets to make a mistake and be forgiven, who has to be perfect just to be allowed in the room. I didn't win to prove anything to him. I won because I belonged here all along. The room was silent, not because they didn't understand, but because she had taken the narrative back with surgical precision. No courtroom tantrum, no emotional collapse, just clarity. Later that evening, Jalaiah sat again at the kitchen table, looking at the scholarship letter. The lawsuit would continue, with or without her vocal presence. The documents were undeniable. The lawyers were relentless. Ms. Aldrich's career hung in the balance. Students were still protesting, but Jelaya had made her choice. She would move forward, not to escape the fight, but to reshape the battlefield. Jelaya steps up to the mic, pauses, and says, "It's not about Trevor anymore." Autumn at Milton University carried a stillness Jelaya hadn't known in months. The wind no longer howled with confrontation. The headlines had cooled. The chants had quieted. But the story hadn't ended. It had only transformed. What once felt like a public war became a quiet inward march. And for the first time in a long time, Jelaya was allowed to just be. Her days became rhythmic. Morning lectures, long hours in the math lab, quiet nights in the library, where fluorescent lights hummed like lullabies. She walked campus paths in silence, never in a hurry, always carrying her notebooks but rarely her phone. Most students whispered when they saw her. Some smiled, some stared. A few tried to strike conversation, but Jelaya rarely engaged. Her name had become bigger than her presence. Magazine covers had followed the court filings. Time, The Atlantic, Wired. Titles read, "The Girl Who Solved the Equation," or "Genius in the Crosshairs." Her face appeared under headlines about race, resilience, and reform. One editorial called her the Rosa Parks of mathematics, a phrase that made her stomach twist. Another compared her to Katherine Johnson, that one she kept. And yet through it all, she stayed silent. Not out of bitterness, but choice. Because silence, she now understood, wasn't absence. It wasn't fear. It was space. It was armor. It was power. While the world processed her in viral waves, she returned to what had always grounded her. The problems, the puzzles, the patterns. She filled whiteboards again, not for survival, not for proof, but for love, for freedom, for the version of herself untouched by scrutiny or praise. But across town, a different story was unfolding. Trevor Maddox had disappeared from public view after Jelaya's press conference. His carefully crafted "just wanted fairness" narrative hadn't held. Internet sleuths dug deeper. A thread appeared on Reddit, linking him to leaked test questions, answers purchased anonymously, traced through a digital payment system tied to a VPN. But it was the email that cracked it wide open. A recovered message from a Lakeshore administrator to Trevor's father, Charles Maddox, titled "About the Chemistry Exam." In it were instructions on smoothing scores quietly, references to favors, and a mention of reputation protection. The story broke faster than the school could spin. Federal education officials launched a full-scale inquiry into Lakeshore Academy. Charles Maddox resigned from 2 real estate boards. Trevor's college applications were flagged, then rescinded. The same media that once turned him into a sympathetic figure now exposed him as the product of academic privilege, lies, and entitlement. No apology came from him, no statement, just silence of a different kind, the kind that follows disgrace. Back at Melton, Jelaya kept her distance from it all. She didn't post, didn't tweet. She declined interviews, refused speaking panels. Her scholarship remained active, her professors respectful. They no longer looked at her like a controversy. They looked at her like a peer. But she wasn't content. Not yet. One evening in late November, she sat at the campus observatory, alone, wrapped in her hoodie, staring through the glass dome at a chalkboard filled with ideas. Her hands moved with gentle certainty, mapping functions and fractals that twisted like galaxies. Her body relaxed, not because the world had been fixed, but because she had stopped trying to fix it through words. That week, she published an op-ed in the New York Times. She titled it simply, "Silence is not weakness." It opened with, "They told me silence was the absence of strength, that if I didn't speak, I couldn't lead. But I've learned silence is something else. It is observation. It is memory. It is the ability to carry pain without folding beneath it, to see truth in a room full of lies and still keep your hands steady when writing the answer." She didn't name Trevor. She didn't mention Lakeshore. But the world read it anyway, and they knew. The op-ed was shared by educators across the country. It was printed in classrooms, used in college writing courses, quoted at protests. She said little in interviews, but those words traveled like wildfire. And yet the moment that would change her again didn't come from press. It came in the form of a note. It was taped quietly to her dorm room door, slipped under the radar of cameras and crowds. The paper was folded into a triangle, edges crisp, handwriting neat. She found it on a Wednesday night after returning from the lab. At first she thought it was junk, a flyer or club invite. But then she opened it. Just 4 words, scrawled in blue ink. Teach me. Tia. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just read it again. Once. Twice. Because for the first time Trevor wasn't demanding attention. He was asking for help. And maybe, just maybe, that changed everything. A note appears on her dorm room door. Teach me. Years had passed, but the echo of Jeliah Brooks's name never truly faded. It matured. The viral headlines were long gone, replaced by something far more enduring. Infrastructure. The fight that had begun with a smirk in a classroom and a single line on a math problem had reshaped lives, policies, and belief systems across the country, and it started not because she shouted, but because she didn't. Jeliah graduated from Melton University with top honors, her senior thesis published in the American Journal of Mathematical Thought. But rather than chase fame, she returned to the very root of her pain and power. She founded Solve for Equity, a national STEM initiative focused on underrepresented youth, especially Black girls who had been told verbally or otherwise that brilliance wasn't meant for them. At first, it was a small grant-funded workshop series in community centers. Then universities joined in. Tech companies followed. By its fourth year, Solve for Equity was in 37 cities. By year 7, it was part of public school curriculums in 4 states. And still, Jeliah didn't chase the spotlight. But the world came anyway. She was invited to speak at conferences, not as a survivor of injustice, but as an architect of change. Her presence carried a weight few people her age ever learned how to bear. She never lectured. She never scolded. But when she spoke, entire rooms sat still. Her words didn't roar. They resonated. Meanwhile, Lakeshore Academy underwent a transformation it never wanted, but could no longer avoid. After the federal inquiry and the lawsuit settlement, it was required to implement sweeping reforms. The disciplinary board was restructured. Anonymous grading systems were introduced. Teachers were placed on yearly equity review. And perhaps most dramatically, Miss Aldridge was promoted to Director of Institutional Change. She no longer taught math. She trained school boards. Her curriculum on anti-racist education became nationally certified, required in over 80 districts by year 5. But not all stories aged with light. Trevor Maddox, once the loudest voice in the room, now lived in quiet obscurity. After his father's company was indicted for fraud, Trevor quietly joined the team under a fake title. Operations Coordinator. He managed calendars, scheduled meetings, picked up dry cleaning. The shame didn't come from the work, but from the silence around it. He had once been the subject of national attention. Now he was a footnote in someone else's. He kept the note Jeliah had never responded to. Teach me in his drawer. Sometimes he reread her op-ed. Sometimes he opened news clips about her keynote addresses. He never reached out again, because sometimes the most powerful apology is the absence of interruption. One brisk October morning, Jeliah stood behind the curtain of a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver her most significant keynote yet. 10,000 students, educators, and leaders had gathered for the National Summit on Educational Equity. Her name headlined the event. She adjusted the microphone clip to her blazer. No notes, just her mind, her memory, and the sentence that had changed everything. The event manager gave her the signal. She stepped into the light. The applause didn't explode. It bloomed. A wave of admiration, not from celebrity but from connection. She walked slowly to the podium, her silhouette casting across the massive screens behind her. And when she reached the mic, she paused, looked out over the sea of faces. Black, brown, white, hopeful, tired, brilliant. Then she began. Check your assumptions. The same words she had said years ago, not as a threat, but as a lens. She told the story, not for sympathy, but for clarity, not for revenge, but to show what happens when a system mistakes silence for incompetence. She talked about how institutions protect those who already have power, how children are tracked, not by skill, but by expectation, how sometimes you have to solve a problem no one wants to admit exists. She didn't mention Trevor, but everyone remembered him anyway. Her voice never shook, her eyes never dropped, and when she finished, the auditorium stood, not with frenzy, but reverence. It was over. Or so she thought. As she exited the stage, a group of school-aged students waited near the stairs. Contest winners, future fellows, wide-eyed and clinging to notebooks like sacred texts. And in the front row, a young girl with dark curls and glasses, raised her hand timidly. Jalaya knelt to meet her eye. The girl whispered, "Can I ask you something?" Jalaya smiled softly. "Of course." The girl looked down, then back up. "Do you think someone like me could do what you did?" Jalaya paused. This wasn't a media question. This wasn't for headlines. This was the beginning of someone else's equation. She nodded, placing her hand gently on the girl's shoulder. But before she could answer aloud, another hand went up, then another, and another, a ripple of questions. It had begun again. A young girl in the front row raises her hand, and it begins again. If you've ever been silenced, doubted, or told you didn't belong, remember Jalaya. Her story isn't just hers, it's ours. The quiet ones are watching, they're learning, and they're coming. Type yes if you believe brilliance has no color. Subscribe if this broke your heart.